Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome everyone to the East Side's first Housing Summit. I'm Peter Ratcliffe of the East Side Freedom Library. We're delighted to have you in the house. Lots of people have been working on this for now probably 7 months. Yeah. Actually the first gathering was in April, but it snowed. So here we are again. But we're delighted you're here. Restrooms are downstairs. I want to especially thank Cian Thomas, Ishmael Khalidi, Ben Weaver, Werner, from ABC Realty, Leon Wong, who you're going to hear from in a minute. A lot of people have been working on this. We've shown several films. TPT has been a big partner in this process. And we've had some great community conversations. It's inspiring to see so many people turning out, so many people being direct with each other, with their neighbors. I should shout out to the Cookie Cart. Best cookies in town. The egg roll queen for the egg rolls. Yeah. So, Cian is going to talk about how we got to this point. Then Leon is going to explain what we're going to do this evening. I'll give the same warning that I always give at these events, that we are Facebook live streaming this with Carla Reilly. It's being videotaped by TPT2. If you're in the witness protection program, hide your face. You never know. So I'm going to turn this over to Cian.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Let's give Peter a round of applause. Is this space awesome or what? Yeah. This is such cool space. And we are very, very fortunate to have Peter Ratcliffe and the East Side Freedom Library here in our neck of the woods. Yeah. With East Side. Oh, okay. Oh, I'm in the witness protection. So I want to talk about how did we get here? I tell you, it has been an interesting and fascinating journey. We decided at ABC Realty, by the way, we are a small boutique black female-owned business here on the East Side, right? And we are rooted in community. We are here and we are rooted in community. And in 2019, we decided that we wanted to take on something bigger than ourselves. We wanted to take on something bigger than buying and selling real estate. And we decided we wanted to take on the home ownership gap. So we stepped into that space to build awareness around the gap and to identify partners working in that space. And if you don't know what the gap is, Minnesota has one of the highest home ownership rates in the nation. It fluctuates annually, but it hovers around 77% for white families in Minnesota. For families of color in Minnesota, that rate fluctuates around 44%. And the difference is what they call the gap. And that's what we wanted to take on. We wanted to step into that space, and we wanted to help build awareness, and we wanted to identify other folks working in that space. So we decided, well, let's have a forum. Let's have a community conversation. And we put together a forum with Peter here at the Freedom Library in April of this year. And we were hoping for 50, okay? Then it started snowing. It was the last big blizzard of April, and we were praying for 20 or 30. And we had 77 people here on one of the snowiest Lake April nights. Right? And then we had some dialogue, we had some conversation. It was off the chain. People were candid, they were real, and we were like, wow, there's a lot of people that have a lot to say. They have a story to tell. They have a story to tell about housing. So Peter approached us, I believe it was in May, and said, you know, people still want, there's still more to say. We should do something. And I got hold of some hot films, just kidding. I got hold of some documentaries, and maybe what we could do is we could have a summer film event and then have a conversation afterwards. So thank you to TPT and the TPT producers. We showed Sold Out, and we followed by a community conversation. We showed Jim Crow of the North, followed by a community conversation, and we showed Detroit 48202, followed by a community conversation. And we also kicked it off with a panel from the labor unions. And I just want to share with you some of the things that we heard in this journey. We heard from young college-educated people that they are renting a room with shared space because they can't afford the rent on their own. We heard from the labor unions, especially the lower wage labor unions, that the number one member concern for their members was housing affordability and stability. We heard from our elders right here in this room that they would love to sell their bread and butter homes, but they can't afford the supporting housing options. So they're stuck, and they can't even maintain the home. And we heard from a lot of young people that want to buy. They would love to buy those bread and butter homes, but those homes aren't available because those elders are stuck in those homes. We heard from young people that did successfully buy a home, only to be met with neighbors that did not want them because of the color of their skin. We heard from people who are experiencing homelessness today, many of whom are working, and they are living in their tractors. So today, with the rising cost of rents, with the rising cost of home prices, if nothing changes, we're on a trajectory that ultimately will lead to only people with means will have access to quality housing. And it's critical that our voices are heard, and we can't wait. We can't wait for someone to come save us. We need to save ourselves. We need to be heard, and we need to be a part of the solution and not the problem to this housing issue today. So with that, I want to thank you again. I'm going to turn it over to Daniel Berg, who's saying no. Turn it over to Leon. Who's saying no. Turn it over to Daniel. Who's saying no. Turn it over to Leon. I could be Vanna. Vanna. Okay, so Daniel Berg. There you go. Thank you.
Great introduction. You just said a good time. It's about story. I really appreciate that, and glad this is being documented and that we're having these conversations. So I'm Daniel Berg, and I'm a producer with Twin Cities PBS, and I produced and directed the film Jim Crow of the North, and we were really honored to have that be a part of this film series. The film has been seen by, maybe 250,000 people, maybe 300,000 at this point on the YouTube count, but more importantly, it's small local discussions like this that really tip the knowledge of this history into action. That's important to us, truly. And so my colleagues and I have been really thrilled to be a part of this movement, these summits. And so I don't forget, I wanted to just plug kind of a continuation of this conversation. Next week, next Tuesday, we want you all to come to TPT finally. We'll do the hosting. We're going to have a conversation about history, housing, and headlines. Really, in producing Jim Crow of the North, one of the things that really struck us was how this issue has been of bias in housing and white supremacy has played out in the media, in the early press, in the black press, and in broadcast media. So we're going to have kind of an interactive discussion with clips and some of my friends from Twin Cities Black Journalists and others. So grab flyers. Hopefully y'all can come next week to TPT. Because it is about story, and I'm really honored to just kind of help set the tone in your evening and really kind of bring us to what emerges in this narrative, and that's the idea of systemic racism. And you all know this. I'm no expert, I'm not really even a historian, I'm a filmmaker, but in the work I've done, the theme, unfortunately, the kind of insidious theme of white supremacy and systemic racism has come up in the 2 decades that I've been doing this kind of filmmaking. A project I produced called Close the Gap, which was really a decade ago, one of our community's first explorations of the disparities that had then been really surfaced in some research, explored place disparities and class and race disparities. One of my, really, a project that's really close to me was a project called Homeless Youth Finding Home that we produced with the Wilder Foundation. And it was really just some amazing young people who had kind of endured homelessness and persevered, but really putting a face on their issues, their struggles, and their stories is part of what we try and do in our films. I did another film, and many of these you can find at tpt.org if you want to check them out, called, it wasn't my idea, American Dream Under Fire. It was a little dramatic, but it was true. Our partners named it, but it was a look at how manufactured housing, mobile homes or trailers, but that's not really the appropriate word, but how that housing source, and this is before the recession, before the bubble, how that housing, that affordable housing source was disappearing. So we were working with some folks who were working on mobile justice and kind of followed along as they were trying to save that kind of housing source. So it's really been, kind of a privilege to be walking alongside the folks who are living some of these struggles in terms of housing and the gap, and also the awesome advocates and activists and others who are working with them. Recently, and I think this is, it really sent me into the work on Jim Crow of the North. We did a project called Make Money Work, and it was with the Wells Fargo Foundation and their LIFT support. And so it was an interesting journey for me and for TPT to work with these good folks at the Wells Fargo Foundation, but to kind of bring them along on their role in this issue. And behind the scenes, as interesting a story as what we ended up with on camera, but the stories are powerful. The 1.5 hour called New American Dreams explores some of the unique challenges that new Americans and immigrants face in housing, but also how there's a lot of cultural strengths and skills that they bring to the issue. And then another film called Financial Freedom was a look at the African American community and our unique and historic trauma, but our historic struggle with systems like banking and trust and some of those systems. So all those films led up to Jim Crow of the North, which we premiered last year and really kind of lives on in conversations like this that expose really kind of the foundation for the systemic racism that a lot of these issues that you all have been exploring is built on. And that's these restrictive covenants, these racist contracts that are buried deep in the deeds of countless homes across America, certainly across the Twin Cities. And I was thinking about, actually, as a Southsider from Minneapolis, and the city of lakes. I love the St. Paul Lakes as well. Phelan is beautiful. I was doing a documentary about parks in the Twin Cities, and you come across accounts of early settlers, residents, I guess, around Phelan, kind of commenting on Dakota camping at the lake in some seasons. And, this kind of narrative of how quaint and odd this was. And, that idea of that lens, of those optics on Dakota in their homeland, kind of returning or coming back, this framing of them as almost interlopers at Phelan, to me, is exactly what we're trying to do, I think, with a movement like this, is kind of change that narrative. To me, that's really, and we know this, the beginning of some of the systemic racism, the stealing of this land, and then these systems that are placed on that land, like the restrictive covenants. So if you don't know, if you haven't followed the Map and Prejudice research, or maybe you haven't seen our film, Jim Crow of the North, these restrictive covenants are contracts in deeds when housing and real estate is developed that describes who the property can or can't be sold to. And in a nutshell, while they're really aggressively restrictive to a number of people, ultimately the research shows that they always impact African Americans. And so early in the 20th century, as the Twin Cities are spreading, both cities are growing, the suburbs, the early kind of suburbs are emerging, these restrictive covenants were kind of baked into the land and the homes. And so what you start to see then in that first decade is some resistance. Of course, we have always resisted, but these restrictive covenants were actually getting codified in court cases and in other systemic kind of affirmations. So they were kind of really entrenching into the development and the spread of housing. About a decade later, 1919, you have Red Summer. You start to see some of the results of this kind of systemic racism, which is kind of emerging out of the markets and of the public sector. But now you start to see what one of the researchers in Mapping Prejudice describes, and when she said it in the interview, it was powerful, as citizen terror. And we know these stories. This is Chicago in 1919, or Tulsa, but it's also Duluth, Minnesota. 100 years ago, next June, 3 African Americans were lynched. And while we think of that story by a mob of 10,000, we think of that story as one of the jailhouse, the classic lynch narrative. What I was taken by when I told a story about that in my documentary North Star was the African Americans who lived in Duluth and how they saw what was coming, but just that idea of their communities, them as homeowners, and what that kind of moment of oppression, what that led to. In the nearby town of Superior, the African Americans were essentially driven out. The small population that was there were all exiled, essentially, from Superior, Wisconsin. So you've got these layers, these strata of systemic racism that are building up through these decades. And in the film, we talk about, in St. Paul, an amazing couple, the Francises. William Francis was an amazing pioneering lawyer, and his wife, Nellie, as Bill Green, the researcher, tells us in his upcoming biography, was a suffragist. She was an amazing community leader. They bought a home in St. Paul and had a cross burned in the yard. And he was appointed an ambassadorship in Liberia, so they left St. Paul. But as Dr. Green describes, even this kind of amazing elite St. Paul couple were kind of spared this kind of reaction, this citizen terror that's described. And this kind of compounds in an institutional way then into the 30s with the rise of red lines. Now, more of us know about red lines. I knew a little bit, but when you kind of look at it, we think that's the beginning of some of this systemic racism. Is when these kind of these borders and boundaries of neighborhoods that are worthy of investment, based on, as I thought, it would be maybe the private sector, maybe banks or insurance companies, but it was actually the federal government, the early Federal Housing Administration that was created during the Depression. They laid out these red lines, and as the Mapping Prejudice research tells us, these red lines were drawn around neighborhoods that had restrictive covenants, so the green lines rather. So the green areas that were worthy of investment were where the covenants were. And as we hear from the researchers in the film, the FHA underwriting manual actually says, you can't get a green line unless there are restrictive, racist, my words, covenants already in place. So again, these layers of systemic racism beginning with the stolen Dakota land, but really the restrictive covenants, the citizen terror in the early part of the 20th century, the red lines, and all the while, the system supporting it with Supreme Court decisions that affirmed this. Eventually, in 1948, the Supreme Court decision finally does a pretty good job of preventing the continual spread of the restrictive covenants. But as we learn in the research, by that point, it's largely too late. Not only are the covenants in place and having the economic effect you would imagine, but the kind of cultural, racial barriers that they've created, patrolled by this kind of white supremacy and this citizen terror, are now solidly in place. And this is where we do start to hear the stories of people who we know, family members who lived through this kind of perpetuated redlining and the restrictive covenants being at the root of that. 20 years later, in 1968, after a lot of effort from the NAACP and other activists and allies, you get the Fair Housing Act, and restrictive covenants really are kind of finally brought to an end, as well as the banking and other systems that were perpetuating the disparities that these were creating. That now is brought to effectively an end with the emergence through the Fair Housing Act of HUD, who kind of patrol the red lines. But again, the damage is done. And as you kind of move into the 70s and then in the 80s, we really started, when you get Reaganomics on top of the other systemic racism, you really do start to see the effects showing up in the kind of disparities worst in the nation here in the Twin Cities. So this narrative, again, of how we got to now is something that we explore in Jim Crow of the North. And it's a tough history. It's one that is real and lived, and there are people behind all the data and the research of the Mapping Prejudice work, and that was part of what I wanted to do in the film, was to remind us that these were people living through this kind of oppression. But that brings us to you all, and what you're doing with this kind of work and this engagement is really armed with that knowledge. How can we kind of find some equity going forward? Having allies and sisters and brothers in the real estate industry, that's really encouraging, and that you all are hosting this, and that I know we've got even present from the political sphere to, I overheard a property owner kind of just saying, like, I think I should be here, this is important, and that's cool. And the rest of you all. So again, really encouraged and heartened by this movement. Glad to have my peeps here kind of documented so we can kind of spread this best practice in a way of community engagement that can hopefully lead to some real change. So great agenda. Renters is something we didn't talk about in Jim Crow of the North. So I'm really glad that you all are exploring that issue. Affordable housing, driving over, I was hearing about the development of the Ford plant and the affordable housing being in the high 300,000s. So I was, in that neighborhood, I guess. But, so the challenges are real. But then also that you're talking about homelessness, that these issues are all part of, the intersectionality of this kind of oppression is real. And so I really appreciate what you all are doing. And again, we can continue the conversation in terms of the role of media, both the problem and maybe the solution next week at TPT, so we hope you can join us. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for sharing and helping us to frame our discussion tonight. Excuse me 1 second, I'm going to just set up real quick before we move on to the next part.
I would dance. No music. Dance. Sing. Oh. It's only a paper moon. Have you seen the moon tonight? It's a beautiful moon, isn't it? No hanging. Almost like fruit from the sky. Take it out. Take it back. How's that? Is that good? Oh.
You're on camera.
Thank you.
Thank you for that interlude there. My name is Leon Wong, and I'm going to kind of give a brief outline of what's going to happen the rest of the night. So we're kind of here together to find connections, talk about issues that's on our mind. There'll be a chance to talk as a big group. There'll be a chance to talk as smaller groups. There'll be an opportunity to discuss using verbal tools and visual tools. So there's sort of a wide array of opportunities for us to share. And we're going to put you guys to work, okay? I promise that. So by the end of the day, you're going to feel like you've hopefully done some heavy lifting and have you moved a few steps forward individually and collectively. And for the night, you can see we have some visual stuff happening here. There's some note-taking, and the idea is we're going to record our discussions tonight, both verbally with words and maybe with some pictures, and that we're going to sort of reflect it back to us And hopefully we'll start to see some connections with different parts of the discussion tonight, and some common themes and opportunities might appear, so they'll become apparent. So I'm going to just kind of get us started, get us kind of warmed up a little bit before we break up into breakout groups. We're going to be doing breakout groups for about an hour, and there'll be 3 different groups, 3 different topics, okay? So one is rental. So, yep, rental is going to be here when we break out. And then it'll be home ownership on that, sort of that corner, and then homelessness will be on that corner. So rental, home ownership, homelessness. And we'll have about an hour to discuss, and actually 40 minutes is going to be verbal discussions, and 20 minutes we're going to do a visual exercise to talk about ideas. And then we're going to come back, report together, report your individual discussions, and sort of synthesize what groups talked about, and then talk about moving forward. Where do we go from here? Okay? So this part here, before I turn you guys loose, I want to acknowledge who's all here. I think it's important who's at the table, right? Doing organizing work, the most important thing is who's at the table. And also think about who's missing, who might not be here tonight, who we might want to invite the next round. So we're just gonna kind of open up the floor, and you guys, voluntarily, popcorn style, just share. You represent a certain demographic, work for a certain organization, certain age group, certain racial, ethnic, just which group do you represent or you belong to show that you're here, okay? And we're just going to put that up on the board and see, to just acknowledge and see who's here, and then again to see maybe who we need to invite, make an effort to invite for the next discussions, okay?
So, excuse me,
Yeah.
I'm understanding that there are 3 groups and 3 topics. I'm not clear on the focus of the discussion. Like, are we looking at the problems as we see it? Are we looking at solutions that we think should be?
So good question. So again, we have rental, home ownership, and homelessness. And we have facilitators leading those discussions. It's really up to the facilitators and the group to kind of discuss, and you guys take the lead. I mean, it's in your own groups, right? And tonight, I think in the end, we're not necessarily looking for answers at this point. I think if we can come away with figuring out kind of a process and a structure for moving forward, and how we're framing these problems that we want to solve, I think that'll be a major step forward. It'll be good progress. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I have a better idea now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so feel free, don't be shy. Which group you're youth, you're part of a certain organization. Hand back there. Just actually, after I let you. Go ahead.
Payne Phelan Community Council's in the house.
Hi, Jack.
Who else is in the house?
District 1.
District 1's in the house. Woo! We got community councils. Who else is in the house?
Let's go.
Realtors in the house.
Freedom from the Streets is in the house.
Freedom from the streets is in the house.
Eastside
Woo! Cookie carts in the house.
Elders.
Eastside Elders in the house. Oh, sorry. Cookie cart. Eastside Elders. Micah's in the house.
District 4.
Ooh, District 4 is in the house.
Micah is M-I-C-A-H.
C-A-H.
She said City Council.
City Council up in the house. Woo!
Isaiah.
Isaiah is in the house.
I'm a landlord.
A landlord is in the house. Woo woo!
Homeownership Center.
Home Ownership Center is in the house. Who else is up in? Pardon? College students in the house. Love it.
National Bank.
First National Bank?
Old.
Old National Bank is in the house. Yes.
St. Paul Federal Credit Union.
Whoa, St. Paul, Old National Bank. OLD, Old National Bank. Right?
And then
And St. Paul Credit Union.
St. Paul Federal Credit
St. Paul Federal Credit Union's in the house. I heard
Homeless outreach worker.
homeless people incorporated. Homeless outreach is in the house.
Minnesota Housing.
Clues is in the house. Minnesota Housing is in the house. You gotta write faster.
MinStep, Minnesotans stand together to end poverty and homelessness.
Minnesotans standing
Minnesota.
together to end poverty and homelessness is in the house.
is there an acronym?
MinStep,
What's that?
MNSTEP.
Minstep.
STEP.
STEP.
Okay.
Any youth in the house?
You guys in high school, middle school?
High school.
High school, oh, we got some high schoolers up in the house. Who else is in the house?
Aging white homeowner.
Pardon? Homeowner?
Aging white homeowner.
Aging white homeowner in the house. Uh-oh, hey, middle-aged black homeowner in the house. Who wants to adopt a middle-aged black woman? All right, who else we got in the house? Do we have churches? No. Yes! We have Mosaic Christian Community in the house. Ooh! Twin City Habitat for Humanity is in the house. Anyone? Huh? A neighbor, yes, a neighbor. Oh, a neighbor. Yeah, that's what I was saying. See, I was just testing you guys to see if you were listening, right? Labor. Yes. Labor, neighbor.
And I'm actually here as a renter. My boss is here representing District 1, so.
Whoa, we got a renter in the house. Woo!
Okay, keep going. Community.
District.
A vision community.
Envision,
Envision Community is in the house. Anyone else in the house?
A teacher.
A teacher! Oh my God, I love teachers in the house. God bless them.
Episodic and long-term homeless survivor.
Episodic and long-term homeless survivor.
Can I just say homeless survivor?
Yes.
Episodic and long-term.
Yeah, episodic and long-term homeless survivor. Awesome. Yes.
American Indian Family Center.
Yes.
Manufactured homeowner.
I like that. American Indian Family Center. And a manufactured homeowner. Sweet. Business owner is in the house. Is Jim here? Did he? He walked out. Did he? Dayton's Bluff Neighborhood Housing Service was in the house. DBNHS. Business owner, DBNHS.
Yes.
Anyone else?
Occupational therapy students.
Awesome! Occupational therapy student. In the house. Anyone else?
St. Paul 350.
St. Paul 350. In the house.
Community organizer for District 10 and District 12. Also queer people.
D10 and D12 community organizers. In the house. Anyone else in the house? A nurse.
All right.
A nurse is up in the house.
Lawyer and
Ooh.
political candidate.
Lawyer and political candidate in the house.
Artist.
Artist in the house. State representative in the house. Poet. That didn't know it. Oh.
I know it.
Oh, okay. Poet that knows they're poets.
Okay, so we probably have, anyone else want to share? Because I want to spend a little bit of time, now we have the list. Are there folks who are not here tonight we should think about inviting? So are there folks who are not on the list, who are not here tonight, we should think about inviting next round? Yes?
There's a public housing high-rise at 1000 Edgerton Street. They would probably, like, if you could flyer and probably get some people, or maybe have it, they have a community center, they would probably be good.
So residents of public housing,
And 1,000 Edgerton?
1000 Edgerton, yeah. Missing tonight.
Listening house?
So 1,000 Edgerton.
Yeah, 1000 Edgerton. I heard homeless youth,
Somebody said listening house.
listening house.
Radius Health.
Radius Health, not in the house.
Listening house.
Listening house, yeah.
And then what was after that?
Radius Health.
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 Community members from Payne Family Neighborhood?
Not in the house? No, nobody from Payne Valens here?
Who's from Payne Family? Like from more from this area, from this, like this neighborhood right here.
I
Like
live
right
right once up.
I know, but more people from this.
Okay, so more residents on the block,
More residents.
on this block, on Greenbrier.
Housing Hub is not here, Housing
Ah.
Hub, and they're buying a lot of,
Housing.
Housing Hub, not in the house.
Are there developers here?
Yes. Ooh, you're in the house, right?
So that's.
So, yeah, all right. Okay. I hope that's going, right? All right.
District 2?
Not in the house?
Not in the house.
District 2 is not in the house. Who else is not here that should be here, guys?
Minnesota Community Care.
St. Paul PED
And Department of Safety and Inspections.
and DIS, PED and DIS.
DSI.
Oh, DSI, FBI. DSI.
Minnesota Community Care.
Okay. Interpreters for people that should be here, but would need interpretation. Thank you. And I heard something else.
Minnesota Community Care.
Minnesota Community Care is not here. And
Catholic Charities.
Catholic Charities is not here.
Metro State.
Yeah. Catholic Charities. Metro State.
I was gonna say my mom.
My mama. My mama is not here.
All are up.
So I'm actually gonna add, so Asian American community.
Right. Yeah. Karen.
Any,
Karen,
That's
East
sort of missing,
African, right, Somali,
African
you
So-
know, they're not here.
POC, immigrant communities,
Yeah,
various
right,
groups are
are not here.
not here,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
trans youth and kids of color.
Mhm. Trans youth are not here. Trans youth.
I want to ask a question. Is it anything like a spark, I mean, in Minneapolis, is it spark in Minneapolis? Is it anything like that over here that help with people with different races? Because I'm born and raised in Minneapolis, St. Paul, born and raised here, and it was, back in the day, it was just black and white. And it was like a lot of people coming in, and over there, they teaching us how to deal with all that. And it's called Spark.
It's
So
called
is it
Spark.
any Sparks here.
Okay. Huh, I don't know. I'm not familiar. If we have anything like that on the St. Paul side, but that sounds like a great idea. I like that.
So I think we can probably just hold the conversation here. As you can see, there are lots of folks and resources represented here, but then there's also lots of folks, who needs to be invited, and lots of work that we could do going forward. So just, we'll keep this up here. You can kind of come back and look at it and use it as part of your discussion if you need to. But for now, we're gonna break you guys off into the 3 groups. So once again, the 3 groups it's actually 3 groups plus 1, I forgot to mention. So we have 3 breakout groups, and then actually at this corner, we're having a story sharing place. So meaning TPT will be here to gather stories. If you want to get in front of the camera, talk about, you have stories to share or just concerns, it's things you want to say to the community, feel free to come up here. And we also have some art making, while you're waiting to be on the camera, you can come up here and doodle and draw and, write stuff. So this is sort of, it's the 3+1. It's rental, homeownership, homelessness, and story sharing, kind of all going on at the same time for the next hour or so. And we're going to keep this kind of loose. I mean, if you are with one group, and after a while you decide you want to check out another group, feel free to kind of move back and forth. And we also might be coming to grab people. If it gets a little slow here, we might come around and say, hey guys, come help us out. Come tell a story. So again, it'll be pretty loose. It's loose yet structured, but basically follow, once you guys break off into the groups, just follow the instructions of your facilitators. Okay? Once again, rental, homeownership, homelessness, and story time. Okay? Please go ahead and take your chairs with you. Once you form your groups, and form a big circle in your area.
Homeownership, we have stories. Homeless